Hello there and welcome to a special Sky News question and answer session about the US action over Iran over the weekend. I'm Jane Secker and joining me in the studio is Dominic Waghorn, who is our Chief International Affairs Editor, and also Stuart Ramsay, who's our Chief Correspondent, who is in Erbil in Iraq. Lots of questions have come into us already. If you have any that occur to you while you're watching this, you can add them to the blog or you can scan the QR code on your screen and submit them and we will try to squeeze them in. We're just going to kick straight off with it. Let's start with Stuart in Iraq for us. Stuart, a message from Caterpillar. What next, he says? Is Iran likely to strike US bases in the Middle East? And if so, which ones?
Well, that is the fear, and it's something that the Iranian government has said it would do if the United States was to join in with Israel and to attack the country. Well, obviously that's happened, and so the whole of this region is waiting to see if they are attacked. And there's an awful lot of bases and an awful lot of personnel in the region, about 40,000 American personnel is here, plus civilians who could also be attacked as well. That's something that has been warned about. And there's lots and lots of bases. There's a base near me in Erbil. It's only a few miles behind this camera. It's at the main Air Force base here, main air base here for the Americans, but it's also an international airport. That's the type of place that could be struck. But of course, the Gulf states as well, they could be hit. They're all within range of Iranian missiles. So maybe Iran can do it. I would just quickly say, though, the United States has made it absolutely clear that if Iran does go after their personnel, their bases, their assets and their interests, of which there are many in Iraq and Syria and across the Gulf, then there will be retribution. But of course, there is another element to all of this, which are the proxies who are militias. Shia militias in Iraq who are naturally aligned to Iran, are part of the military infrastructure of the country, but don't really align themselves necessarily to what the government wants and could act unilaterally. Now, they are also very capable of carrying out strikes. So the city 56 miles away from here, Mosul, that could easily attack here with drones, for example, and we know that there are many Shia militia there. So those are sort of things that could happen. So the Iran as a country, but also their proxies. And that they've also been given the warnings by the United States that the retribution will be taken against them. But there are many options for Iran and for those proxies to attack, because these bases are protected. We know they're on high alert at the moment, but they are vulnerable. Some of them are very small. Some of them are basically outposts. They could all be attacked. And again, civilians could be as well. So there's a high state of alert here. We'll
come back to you on civilians in a short while, Stuart. But let's bring in Dom to answer a question. This is coming from Lorraine, and she wants to know about what's actually happened in Iran about the uranium. Did the Iranians move most of the uranium from Fordo? Are there satellite images showing where it went?
Yeah, so Fordo is the base, the nuclear facility near Tehran that was the most protected because it was buried deep underground, because Iran has been trying to protect its nuclear facilities from what has happened in the last week or so, being attacked by Israel and then America. So it was buried deep under this mountain, and America hit it, as we now know, with bunker-busting bombs, these massive ordnance penetrator bombs. But we now seem to think, and this is coming from a number of quarters, that the Iranians saw it coming and moved at least some of their enriched uranium from Fordo, but also possibly from the other bases or nuclear facilities it has at Isfahan and Natanz. And intriguingly, not long before America's attack on Fordo, there was a whole lineup of lorries, trucks outside Fordo that were moving something. So the IAEA, which is the UN nuclear watchdog, reckons there's 408, I think, kilos of enriched uranium that's sort of gone walkies. It's been taken somewhere by the Iranians, and it's not clear where it is. Now, of course, that is absolutely crucial, because what the Iranians have been doing is taking uranium and spinning it in centrifuges, sort of gaseous form, to levels of enrichment far beyond what you need for the scientific civilian purposes they've always claimed the nuclear program is just about. So no one's believed that, but up to 60%. Now, if you can get it up to 60%, it's a short hop up to 90%, where uranium is what you call fissile material. It can be packed into a warhead. There are various stages to get there, but eventually you can make a nuclear weapon out of it. And it's having got that far that the Israelis say they felt they had to get involved and destroy the nuclear program. So, where this is, the location of this enriched uranium is crucial because the Israelis will believe until it's found and neutralized, then the Iranians still pose a nuclear threat. But also it kind of undermines the whole basis of the Israeli-American now joint operation against Iran, because it was meant to obliterate Iran's nuclear program, which is certainly what Donald Trump claimed over the last 24, 48 hours. Doesn't seem to have obliterated if that enriched uranium is somewhere else in Iran, presumably hidden somewhere where it could be used for nefarious purposes by the Iranian government at some point in the future.
Stuart, back to you. You were talking about possible attacks that possibly civilians could be affected by this in terms of Iran and retribution. If it is going to target civilians through terrorist attacks around the world, where would they be likely to hit, do you think?
Well, it could actually be anywhere. So it could be civilians here in the Middle East, in the Gulf states as well. Of course, there are lots and lots of American nationals who live and work in these countries. But there is also a fear it could be in countries like the UK, it could be in Europe, where groups decide or individuals decide to carry out attacks in support of Iran. And there's been warnings about that. It's been one of those ones in the background for a while now that's been discussed. And it comes under, I suppose, like umbrella statement where any option is available to us. And that could literally be terror attacks in Europe and the UK and elsewhere. It doesn't necessarily also mean that it would be confined just to United States citizens. It could also be foreign nationals of countries like the UK that are perhaps seen or deemed to be very much part of the process by which they give agreement or not agreement, but don't condemn United States or Israeli activities. And obviously the UK, particularly with Israel, has been very supportive over the last year or so. So anyone is potentially a target. And I think that is something that security services have been looking at, and a number of countries have issued warnings about that. But at this stage, it seems to be very much focused into the Gulf and into the Middle East generally for American nationals. But I would say that you would be very unwise to say it couldn't go further than that. Now, whether that's state-organised by Iran, that's another subject, but they are continuously accused, particularly by the United States, of being a government that supports terror around the world. And the natural progression of that argument is that they would in some shape or form be involved. It's difficult to know, but it's definitely a possibility. And certainly American nationals within this region are concerned about their own safety. There's no doubt about that. And of course, the military personnel are as well.
Well, Stuart, just as you're saying that, we've got a bit of breaking news and a question on it from Anonymous. Qatar has just announced it's shutting its airspace. Now, over the course of today, we've seen the US and the British embassies in Qatar advising Britons and Americans there to take shelter, to stay in a safe place. Dominic, to you, how significant would you say it is that the airspace is now being shut over Qatar?
Yeah, so that I think it's very significant because, this could only happen, I think, with some specific intelligence. And we're also hearing that Qatari airspace is shutting as well. Various sources reporting that. Can't confirm it, but certainly that's what sources in the region are saying. As you're saying there as well, Americans and British nationals being advised to take shelter. And I think the fear is here that Qatar, of course, has Al Udeid air base in it, which is one of the biggest American air bases. Stuart was saying there are American bases all around the region, and Al Udeid is a huge base. I've been there many years ago. It's so big it has its own Tenpin bowling alley. It's sort of town within a base. It's enormous. Yeah. It's a very big target.
I've been there as well during the Second Gulf War, and it is enormous, isn't it?
It's absolutely colossal. And the RAF has a small bit of it. So the Brits are there too. And, that would be one of the more extreme options is the Iranians would go for. As Stuart's saying there, they're trying to work out how to retaliate to what America's done. To do nothing would be showing even more weakness, and that's very dangerous for the Iranian leadership. You might think they would try and start killing Americans because that drives a wedge between Donald Trump and the MAGA supporters who've already, before he got drawn into this, saying you're the president who said you would end these far away forever wars. You're now getting drawn into another one. So if Americans start dying, that debate, that civil war within the MAGA movement and the Republican right of American politics is only going to intensify. So the Ayatollahs might be calculating that's a good way to deter him from getting drawn further in, not using that enormous amount of firepower he's amassed in the region. On the other hand, though, if they start killing Americans, that firepower will be levelled at them. So it's a difficult calculation going in the minds, we assume, of the planners and the Ayatollahs in Tehran. Qatar could be one target for the Iranians to fire missiles. That it's a short hop over the Persian Gulf, but it would obviously bring upon the Iranians the full power of the military power of a superpower. There are 3 American aircraft carrier groups in the region, but yes, clearly there is something going on that is persuading the Americans and the British that there is some kind of threat to Qatar currently underway.
Stuart, if we're talking about widening this out and if there is retribution, we're looking at it from the American and British side, but what about the other side? Tina Boo asks, are China and Russia going to get involved now?
Well, Russia is involved to a certain degree already. It was hosting meetings with Iranian officials today. They've been asking for help. I'm not exactly sure what help they can do. When it comes to military, obviously they're somewhat taken up and preoccupied with Ukraine, but relations between the United States and Moscow have been getting better, no doubt about it, certainly under President Trump. And maybe the Iranians are hoping that Russia can bring some pressure to bear upon Trump. I'm not sure exactly what it is they're after. I think Dominic will help me here, I'm sure, but I think from the Ayatollah there was a letter delivered in Moscow today asking for that assistance. And it's presumably to try to bring about discussions. I think when it comes to what reaction Iran takes, is there a possibility by which an accommodation is made, is that they're allowed to do something that America potentially knows about already? And we know, for example, the embassy in Baghdad is effectively empty. There could be a symbolic attack upon that, I suppose, as the type of thing that we're looking at. But China has been quiet on this so far. Obviously, the usual condemnations you would expect. They always say, we believe in democracy and diplomacy and discussion rather than war. Russia's directly involved in as much as that it is in talks with Iran, and I suppose we see how much further they would be pushed to go. But I can't really see them in putting themselves in the middle of any of the actual fighting, if you like. I don't see that happening, but diplomatically I think they will try to bring as much pressure perhaps on the United States and other countries as they can. Which
I think leaves the Iranians rather put out, because they actually have a security agreement with the Russians, which it doesn't oblige the Russians to help the Iranians, but I think the Iranians would have expected a bit more from their Russian allies. They've done a huge amount to help them in Ukraine, of course, giving them not just drones, but the technology to make more drones. But, I think Stuart's right. I think if you're Russian or Chinese, you won't like what's going on in the Middle East, but there's no real margin in it for them to get involved in what is it's now a serious war between Israel and Iran. They won't like it. I mean, certainly what's happened to Iranian air defences doesn't make the Russian suppliers of those air defences look very good, but it's very problematic. No one gets drawn into a Middle Eastern war unless they really have to.
And we're talking about China and how they're not going to be looking on this favourably. It's also the possibility of Iran talking about closing the Strait of Hormuz, Dominic, and China would be a big loser there, wouldn't they? Because a huge amount of Chinese oil comes through there. Yeah,
and I was talking to Ed Conway, our economics editor, about this morning in another podcast, and he was making the point that throughout our careers, for as long as we and Stuart and you have been journalists, we've all sort of gamed out what would happen if one of the great what-ifs of our time actually did happen, Israel attacking Iran. And central to that was this threat the Iranians have always made, which is they would close the Strait of Hormuz. For people who are not familiar with the geography, that's this kind of pinch point at sort of the end of the Persian Gulf, where this hugely important strategic waterway narrows to quite a narrow point. And through that point, a fifth of the world's oil passes, but also a huge amount of other seaborne commercial trade. Now, the Iranians have always said that they could shut that, and they would if their nuclear program was attacked. Well, they haven't done so far, and I think it remains an option. But yeah, one of the reasons they wouldn't do so is it would be bad for China, who have been buying Iran's oil. And Iran needs to sell its oil. It needs to make money from that oil. And the Israelis have been going after some of its oil installations, refineries and other things. And it's a very important source of revenue. So if they did block that off, it would be a bit like kind of sitting on a branch and sawing it off. It would achieve a certain strategic aim, but also do the Iranians a huge amount of damage. But they are in such a tight spot. And also they've lost so much of their leadership. And their leader, the Ayatollah, is an 86-year-old old, ill man. And so I think, to expect them to behave as rationally and logically and pragmatically as they have in the past, might be a bit unrealistic. They may start doing things, lashing out, that could be, counterproductive and illogical, but I don't think we could rule it out completely.
Interesting. It perhaps brings us on to a question from Ellie. I'll put this one to you, Stuart. Is regime change coming in Iran? I mean, do you feel, somebody who's watched it for so many years, that we're on the cusp of something here or not?
I think, for example, a country like Israel would love it to happen. And we know that President Trump, yesterday sort of basically said it's not PC to talk about regime change, but maybe we should make Iran great again. MIGA is how he put it. They might like that. For regime change to happen, my expectation, if there was to be an attempted taking out of this government, I think there would be absolute chaos in the country, because there isn't a developed opposition that's in a position, I believe, to take over the control of the government with a popular force, if you like. Maybe people don't like the regime as it stands right now, but it's been there for a very long time. It's extremely well organised, and the opposition groups, and Dominic's been there, he knows it much better than me, are not as well organised, and they're not in that, you don't get that sense that they're there for that change. I think what's really crucial at the moment is that the country isn't talking about this regime, it's actually talking about nationhood, and that people that we've spoken to, we've been talking to people in Iran are saying that they're feeling actually very united. The last time they remember a war was against Iraq, of course, and that united the nation. So to forget about the Ayatollahs, forget about the guards, but actually the nation itself feels that it's under attack. I don't think that the conditions are in place for regime change to happen now. It's not impossible, but just taking out the leadership structure doesn't bring about regime change. It's got to be much more fundamental than that. And I don't believe we're at that point. I could be completely wrong, but doesn't feel like we're at that point. And there are references made to Syria and the regime change that has happened there. That was over 10 years of fighting that has reached the point to where we are now. This is completely different. We're talking a couple of days of them being under attack. Now, if it goes on and on, if conditions get worse and worse and worse, maybe. But you've still got to have an organised opposition group that is powerful enough to take over, or, and perhaps this is the key, an internal change whereby the military, the security forces, the legislature actually join together and say we have to make a change for the future of the country. But that's a very different proposition. I don't believe that just happens overnight.
Dominic's nodding along as you were saying all of that, Stuart. We've got some quick fire questions from some people. This is from Dominic 47, not you, Dom. What do the strikes actually mean for the UK?
Well, I think they're a cause of concern for the UK because they draw America into this now, and America is an ally of Britain. And I think it's very difficult for the British government because what Israel and America are doing is suiting one of the goals of one of the great foreign policy goals of the UK that the UK has had for decades now, which is the end of Iran's alleged nuclear weapons program, but it's the means by which that end is being sought that's the problem for the British, but not just the British, for the Europeans as well, because for those European countries who did negotiate a diplomatic solution to this nuclear problem in Iran that sort of came to fruition in 2015, a military solution is just dangerous. We've heard from the Starmer government saying that the region's a powder keg, and firing into that is very dangerous. The sparks could fly everywhere, and it could lead to a much bigger conflict. So they want a diplomatic solution. That's what they had in 2015. Of course, Donald Trump pulled America out of that deal. And then the Iranians went back to enriching uranium, and pretty much, the chain of events led to where we are today. So the British are not involved in this. They don't support it. They will welcome the end to Iran's nuclear weapons program, but they are deeply concerned about where this is leading. And I think for us, there is this risk that, as Stuart was saying, it's like maybe further down the road, it's not as central to the list of concerns that we are facing at the moment. But that is the risk of asymmetric warfare. The Iranians are very good at attacking various targets around the world in hybrid ways that they can kind of plausibly deny or think they can. It could lead to Iranian attacks on the streets of Britain. And that's certainly exercising minds in Whitehall. We know that was the focus of one of the Cobra meetings. So I think that the British are preparing for everything, because this is a fast-moving situation that is potentially very dangerous, not just for the Middle East, but also for us back home.
Another quick fire question. This one for you, Stuart. It was one that was put to Mark Rutte, actually, this afternoon, NATO Secretary General. Were the US strikes illegal or unconstitutional?
Potentially both, but Congress decides if the country goes to war, but there are an awful lot of caveats to that. If the United States president believes that the country is an imminent threat, he can or she can carry out military action as they see fit. Now, the argument here, particularly, is that the nuclear operations or otherwise of the Iranian government have been going on for a very long time, and it didn't just suddenly change. Of course, the argument back is, well, actually, we've got new information that says that they were about to produce a nuclear weapon, and so we had to act. So it's in the defense of the nation they can do that. But there is also another act, it's the authorization for the use of warfare, and that allows the president to carry out, effectively, to go to war if he or she so wishes, and President Bush used that for the war in Iraq. So, strictly speaking, Congress decides the war. Is this impeachable? Strictly speaking, yes, except those caveats are in place. There's no way they're getting that through Congress to try and impeach him on this issue. It's just not going to happen. The Republicans wouldn't allow it. So whether it's constitutional or not, I think it's just covered by the fact that the president can really do an awful lot of things. Whether it's illegal is another discussion, but I suspect, again, that it's covered by presidential advice and his belief that it is in the nation's interest, and therefore would probably win on a legality basis. Though we know that a number of countries, including the United Kingdom, have been raising their hands and saying, we're not sure this is actually legal. But I suspect in the United States, which, let's be honest, on this issue really is the only one that matters, is that it would be covered by the caveats that allow the president to act in the what he considers to be the interests of the United States.
Okay. Another quick fire one, but this is also a bit of a minefield. Dom, I'll give this one to you. We saw David Lammy in the Commons this afternoon saying Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. Kent Ford asks, why is Israel allowed nuclear weapons, but Iran isn't? Yeah,
this is a tricky one. It'd be even trickier to answer if I was in Israel, where you get into tricky water quite quickly, talking about Israel's nuclear weapon capability. The Israelis have a policy of nuclear opacity, which means they neither confirm or deny they have a nuclear weapon, but I think it's widely assumed that they do. And there was a whistleblower in the 80s called Mordecai Vanunu, you might remember the name, who was a nuclear scientist who came out and told the press that, yes, they did have a nuclear weapon, and he was put in jail for a long time, much of it in solitary confinement, and came out claiming he'd been treated barbarically by his government for simply coming out and confirming what many people assumed to be true. Israel is not a member, because it won't confirm or deny, it's not a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran is. So there's a certain irony there. And that means that there are various arguments that Israel is actually not entitled, and actually it's illegal for the Americans to give them aid, because if you're not a member of the NPT, as 191 countries are, they're in the company of North Korea, I think South Sudan and various other countries, not particularly illustrious company. But if you're not in the NPT, then there are various penalties that you pay, particularly in terms of not getting aid and support from other countries, which is one of the reasons why Iran has not pulled out. It's threatening possibly to pull out, but if it does, there are ramifications for Iran. So, I think, people are entitled to think there is one rule for Iran and one for Israel, and Israel kind of gets round that by refusing to confirm or deny. And more to the point, its allies don't really press the point and force them to do so either. But it suits Israel's purposes to keep their enemies guessing as to whether they have the nuclear deterrent. And also it makes it easier for them to, as I say, avoid the downside of not being in the NPT.
And one that's just come in actually from someone who's just watching it live. Bob, he's just submitted a question. I'll put this one to you, Stuart. He says, if Donald Trump says that the strikes over the weekend were successful in destroying Iran's nuclear infrastructure, why is Israel still striking Tehran this afternoon?
Because Israel's going to continue to do what it sees its own missions are. It wanted the big one done, and Donald Trump has done that. But they're going to continue striking the same places that the United States has struck, and will do other ones as well, with a list that they're not making, obviously not telling us what that is. But from the Israeli military, from the government, we have been told there are a series of objectives that they wish to achieve, and when they've achieved them, they will stop. Now, there can be mission creep on all of these things. The United States will know what those are. I'm pretty certain of that, and I'm sure Dominic will expand on that if he feels the need. But I would say they will know. But the big one was the attacks that happened yesterday, and the Israelis will continue to follow up, going through their objectives. Can I just quickly go back, Jed, just to talk about the nuclear club? I think one of the really interesting things about this is nobody can sort of join up and become part of the nuclear, if you like, the hierarchy that has the nuclear weapons until they do. And when they do, they're in the club. And that is what Iran has been saying, it's what North Korea thinks as well. And they're watching, because when we get the bomb, everyone treats us differently, and that's what this is all about. It's not about, that's why they're trying to stop them doing it, and that is how the nuclear club works, because you can't have it until you've got it, and then everyone has to let you join the club. Which is
why regime change is so important for the Israelis, because the Iranians have the know-how. They can kill as many scientists as they want, the Israelis, but that know-how, that knowledge is now disseminated widely amongst the nuclear scientific community in Iran. They clearly have a certain amount of rich uranium. They have a very big country, and so they still have the capability to put all that together and build a bomb. And they have even more reason to do so now, because their worst nightmares that they've always warned their people would happen have finally happened. The Zionists, as they call the Israelis, and the Americans have come after them. So they will go hell for leather to build the bomb if they can, and if the Israelis allow them to do so. The only way the Israelis can really stop that for sure is to change the regime in Iran. But as Stuart was saying, that is a very big challenge for the Israelis to pull off. And actually what they're doing, the Americans are doing, as he was saying, probably makes it less likely that that's ever going to happen, in the immediate future at least.
A question just coming from Claire. This is about Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi leader. He's apparently spoken to Meloni and Macron about what's been going on. Dom, I suppose you're the relevant one to put this to, but not Starmer. She says, does this show that the UK is becoming irrelevant in Middle Eastern politics?
I don't think it's irrelevant, but it's less relevant and it's less important than Saudi Arabia is, for obvious reasons. The Saudis have a vested interest. If the Persian Gulf gets shut down, or those Strait of Hormuz do get shut down, then the Saudis have not many ways to get their oil to market. They're just over the water across the Persian Gulf to the Iranians. They've had a long and difficult relationship with the Iranians, but actually their diplomatic relations have improved a lot under Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince who runs Saudi Arabia, and with Chinese kind of diplomacy. And the Saudis clearly want, what's become fairly obvious, is they want to have a kind of Middle East that basically does good business. It makes good big deals, that it's peaceful, that it's stable and makes its people richer. It wants to do that under a very authoritarian government, particularly in Saudi Arabia. But it's supporting the new Syrian government because it hopes that they can produce a more peaceful, stable country there as well. And they don't want to see the region descend into chaotic violence, which is what they're very worried, I think, as everyone else is. The Americans and the Israelis could be taking the region towards. The British have their own interests, but I think certainly in terms of the diplomatic weight and their interests, their skin in the game, the Saudis are more relevant at the moment than the UK.
Stuart, cheeky question from me, although I shouldn't really be submitting one. What is the feeling where you are at the minute? I mean, is there an enormous nervousness there that perhaps you're on the brink of something happening?
Well, we're in Kurdistan, and they're obviously in Iraq. They obviously have differences with their own government. They would like to be a separate country in their own right. They, though, are really quite reflective of quite a lot of Arab people and countries who aren't too keen on Israel, but don't like Iran much either. And many of these Arab countries see that Iran really is a troublemaker and has been a source of terror and a source of causing problems in the region for a very long time. And certainly a lot of the people I've been speaking to here in this part of the country, it'll be different further to the south, which is predominantly Shia. But the people up here don't mind what is happening to Iran. They don't like them much at all. What is really interesting across lots of these countries who don't particularly like Iran but aren't too keen on Israel either, but are prepared to perhaps do business with them, Saudi Arabia is one, is what is happening in Gaza. And that really should never be discounted. What is happening there is having a direct effect upon many, many countries in this part of the world, because while Israel does that, they are not going to turn a blind eye when they come to attack Iran. They just simply won't, because they want that to stop. And that is something that Israel really does have to consider when it carries out such major operations. The United States has to consider it as well when it's carrying out such major attacks in Iran, where without Gaza taking place, I suspect a lot of countries would literally say nothing. But now, because of what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank, they will actually object, perhaps, to both. And that's a real problem for both the United States and Israel. But they are real facts, and it's something that you hear here all the time.
Yeah, it shouldn't be forgotten, Dom, that it is the central conflict that there's like spider's legs just run through all the other different countries in that region, don't they?
Yeah, and I think the danger is that what's happening with Iran is consuming bandwidth, if you like, in terms of the way the world is looking at this. The attention's coming off Gaza. There's a limited amount of diplomatic processing power, if you like, in Western capitals. It's all focused on Iran at the moment. And as Stuart is saying, it needs to be focused also on Gaza, where horrendous things are happening. We're seeing scores of people being killed, particularly at that sort of disastrous aid point in the south of Gaza, and hundreds being injured on an almost daily basis. And it's just not being noticed. And just before what Israel did, just before that happened, we were on the point of France possibly recognising Palestine. It was so concerned about the state of what you might or might not call the peace process, so worried about Gaza as well. We had the British government sanctioning 2 members of the Israeli government, completely unprecedented. And there was a huge amount of pressure on Israel. That's come off now, but we really can't take our eyes off Gaza. I mean, obviously, mainly because of the humanitarian situation that is happening there, that's utterly disastrous. The huge loss of life, but also because, this grand vision that Trump has, Netanyahu has, Mohammed bin Salman is buying into as well, and even the new revolutionary leader of Syria is buying into in a sense as well, because he says he would like eventually to join the Abraham Accords, which were the main foreign policy achievements of the Americans under Trump in his first term in office. That's all about building up a process of normalization and ending the ancient rivalries that have caused so much bloodshed and misery in the Middle East. That's not going to happen, and that is not going to make any further progress, particularly with the Saudis, while Gaza remains a festering sore, while the Israelis continue killing thousands of Palestinians there. And that's one of the reasons why Hamas carried it out, let's face it, and the Iranians supported it, because things were moving very much against them. They felt they were being marginalised. Lots of other reasons why Sinwar did this very cynical, very evil sort of terrorist mastermind, but that was clearly one of the motives. But, this vision of a more stable, more peaceful Middle East that all these leaders seem to be supporting, that's not going to go anywhere while Gaza remains unresolved. So, there are lots of good reasons that the world needs to stay very focused on Gaza.
Indeed. Right, time for the final question, and I'll get both of you to give your thoughts. And this is from Josh R. And he says he's part of the younger generation. He describes himself as late millennial, early generation Z. Watching this unfold, Josh says, is quite frightening. In the way it's transpiring, how close is this to turning into another Middle Eastern war, similar to the Gulf and Iraq wars? Could it escalate that far? I'll go to you, Dom, first, and then we'll cross to Stuart at the end.
Well, I don't think it'll go that far in the sense that it's going to draw in other big powers. Let's hope not, at least. I mean, it's beginning in a very different way because the other Gulf wars obviously began with a huge amount of effort by America to line up a coalition behind them because it was very concerned about the rule of international law and because it believed, always has believed since the Second World War, in multilateral organisations and the idea that together with its allies, America is much stronger. Donald Trump doesn't seem to believe that, and he seems to believe it's fine to go it alone, just supporting Israel, which is actually a more dangerous path for the Americans. I think it's unlikely to draw in Russia and China, and if they can help it, they're not going to get drawn in as well, the regional allies. But wars are very hard to predict. They always follow the laws of unintended consequences. The longer this goes on, the risk of miscalculation and misunderstanding leading to escalation gets greater. And, for instance, if the Iranians did fire at Qatar, or the Qataris believed they were being fired at and fired back before they were being fired at, you could see a massive escalation there leading to potentially other countries being drawn in. So, I think it's, whatever generation we're in, we're entitled to be very concerned about what's going on and entitled to hope that the diplomatic efforts to resolve it do bear fruit fairly quickly.
Stuart, your final thoughts?
I don't think that we're going to see invasions taking place. And I think that, I suppose, ultimately that's the big difference between the Gulf War 2003. I was here. I'm actually in Erbil, which was where I was embedded for 3 months. This is the final destination we were to come. I don't know how much you can see behind me, but you probably, this direction you can't. There's skyscrapers and developments here that just did not exist in that war. But that has been a long, long time, obviously, and unexpected and consequences of that invasion that were terrible for Iraq. Kurdistan has been fortunate, it has come out of those problems. What I don't see with this crisis in particular is invading armies, but I think Dominic's right, we could get drawn into more warfare. There could be wars, but I don't think being the same as the Gulf War.
Okay. Stuart Ramsay out in Erbil in Kurdistan in Iraq, and Dominic Waghorn here in the studio. Thank you both very much. It's been great to pick both of your minds in a slightly longer form way than I normally do it. So for me, it's been really illuminating. Thank you for watching and for submitting all of your questions. I hope you've got something out of it. Thanks very much for joining us.